Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Wednesday edition of Growing Your Own Food and Medicine. And today we're talking with Sarah Dalziel-Kirkkhevel, author of Growing Mushrooms for Beginners. Sarah lives in rural Canada with her husband and her daughter, her very young daughter. She's passionate about gardening and creative ways of growing food in small spaces. She grew up on Joybilee Farm, helping with herb gardening, mushroom growing, and many other projects. She finds connection and peacefulness in gardening and finds joy in blessing others when the garden produces abundantly. Sarah is the author of Growing Mushrooms for Beginners, a simple guide to cultivating mushrooms at home that's being published in May by Rockridge Press. And she shares her gardening knowledge and enthusiasm at the blog ninjagardening.com. So welcome, Sarah. So nice that you would join us today, and so nice that Maisie is sleeping and quiet so that you can. So to start off with, tell me why you wrote a book about mushroom growing. That seems like a kind of a fun topic, pun intended.
Well, I guess that's implying that mushrooms are a lot of fun, guys. So it's very fascinating to study and research on mushrooms, and that was one of the reasons that I agreed to write the book. And also in researching mushrooms, I found out they were very beneficial, both for eating and enjoying and for using in your garden.
You're here today specifically to talk about how mushrooms can be used on purpose in the garden. Last week, I talked in my Facebook Live about how if you see mushrooms in the garden that are already growing, not to get rid of them, that they actually are serving a beneficial purpose in nature and in your garden. But today you're going to talk about not growing mushrooms that are just happen to be there, but actually to intentionally cultivate mushrooms in the garden and how that can benefit the garden. So go ahead and tell us what you prepared today.
All right. So as you already talked last week about the wild mushrooms, I am going to start a PowerPoint screen share, if that's all right.
Yep, that's fine. I think I gave you.
Okay, it'll just take a second to me to go into this. Is that showing clearly?
That's showing for me.
All right. So you already talked last week about how seeing mushrooms indicates a couple things about your soil. So the wild mushrooms are signs of healthy garden soil or a very healthy potting soil. I've seen a couple of people asking if mushrooms in their potting soil was a bad thing or a good thing. And wild mushrooms are most likely not going to be edible. One of the most common types I've always seen in the compost pile was ink cap mushrooms, which are very fun to play with, but you don't want to try to eat them. They won't hurt your plants, and if you do try to get rid of them, it's not going to work very well because all you see when you see a fruiting mushroom is the fruiting body, and the mycelium of the mushroom is already everywhere in your garden. So it's not actually going to be possible to get rid of them, which is why they're a good thing, and we're very glad they're a good thing. Mushrooms indicate your soil is healthy, bioactive, and clean, because the mushrooms clean your soil and help make it healthier. There are two primary types of mushrooms we can use in the garden to partner with, and those are the wine cap stratiferia mushroom, which is a very distinctive, very large mushroom. It's also known as garden giant, and as the king stratiferia. And this particular mushroom is one of the easiest ones to identify, which is why it's a good one to introduce to your garden to partner with. The other variety has the Latin name agaricus, and that includes our white button mushrooms, portobello mushrooms, and porcini mushrooms are all in the same family. These two mushroom varieties need soil, dirt, manure, straw, etc. to grow, and they're also very aggressive colonizers. So the function of the mushrooms is to increase organic matter in your soil. They'll break down your mulch, your straw, your leaves, etc., and make the organic matter more available to your plants quicker than the standard composting routes. They increase the biodiversity and resilience in your garden because they will also partner with your individual plants as you plant them. Wine cap are a uniquely aggressive mushroom, in that they will chase and destroy soil nematodes with their mycelium. And a very unique function of mushrooms is that they will consume the juggulin from walnut and butternut plants that inhibit the growth of certain species. So you can actually grow species that don't like walnut closer to your walnut trees if you have mushrooms in your soil. Now, there are several ways to partner with mushrooms. You can make hugelkultur beds with wood waste and inoculate the logs with mushroom plugs before you build the bed. This introduces the mushrooms into the wood and will help the logs break down faster in the bed, as well as giving you mushrooms that will grow and crop out of the bed as you're growing your plants on the top. Usually in these cases, some people will use other species of mushrooms like oyster mushrooms or lion's mane mushrooms for hugelkultur beds in preference to the stratifaria or the button mushrooms. You can create deep mulch zones, such as paths, or if you have water runoff from your roof or from gutters, you can create mulch soil trenches and then deep mulch in the soil trenches and introduce mushrooms to those areas. The runoff from the roofs or your driveway or a parking area will actually get cleaned by the mushrooms and give your garden clean water instead of contaminated water to use. If you have paths in your garden with chips made out of wood chips or out of paper or cardboard, you can add mushroom spawn there, and the mushrooms will grow from the paths and spread out into the garden area. Another tactic I was reading about is called mushroom totems, where you take a solid block of wood and two thinner blocks, and you put the mushroom spawn on either end and sandwich it in place with those extra two blocks, wrap it up in plastic and store it until it's fully mycelated or fully colonized. And then you can bring it out to a cool area and fruit it. And when it's done fruiting, you can take that mushroom totem and put it into your hugelkultur bed, into your compost, into your garden, and have the mushrooms break down the wood to be added to your soil after you've already had a harvest of mushrooms. And it's slightly easier to create a mushroom totem than it is to create standard plug inoculated mushroom logs. If you're also wanting to grow mushrooms on their own, the spent mushroom grow bags can be added to the compost. And again, the mushroom mycelium will help your compost break down, and the already created mushroom compost also adds nutrients to your soil. Also, if you have extra mushrooms from the grocery store, those are the button mushroom agaricus species, you can just add them to your compost and they will actually start creating mycelium and creating mushroom fruitfulness just from using the old mushrooms. Never eat a mushroom from your garden that you didn't plant or can't identify. If you are planting mushrooms in your garden, make sure you've studied your species and know what it is and what it looks like. Also, if you are planting button mushrooms or agaricus species, they will always fruit in clusters of at least 2 or 3 mushrooms. Never eat a mushroom that looks like a button mushroom that's singular. Another benefit of mushrooms is they don't use the same material in the soil that your garden plants use. So you get 2 crops and 2 harvests from the same space without the plants competing. Mushrooms don't compete against your tomatoes don't compete against your mushrooms. Both mutually benefit each other. You'll have fewer soil-borne pests like the nematodes because of the prevalence of mushrooms and because the mushrooms will attract other beneficials to the area, like earthworms absolutely love mushroom mycelium. One moment, please.
No problem. Sarah's just gone to pick up Maisie, and she'll be back with us in just a second. There she is. Hi, Maisie. Hello, Maisie.
She napped for a little bit.
Good for her.
As I was saying, earthworms absolutely love mushroom mycelium, and having mushrooms in your garden will attract even more earthworms, which will also attract birds and other friendlies and beneficials into the area, anything that likes eating worms. You'll also end up with healthier plants in general because the roots of plants communicate with the soil, with each other, and with fungi in the soil. And so you'll, as the fungi help break down nutrients for your plants, they'll also help with the communication of your plants to each other, and you'll end up with larger, more fruitful plants than if you didn't have the mushrooms in your soil. Depending on where you place your mushrooms, you'll end up with cleaner garden and yard areas, with any water running that isn't being used by your plants that runs off your property or runs onto your property from your neighbors will not carry harmful chemicals into your area, watershed, or into any of your fish-bearing streams that are nearby. Well, some of the most chemical-laden runoffs that we have from our cities is the runoff from the roofs and from the lawns because of the chemical fertilizers and stuff that are being used there. So adding mushrooms into your garden will help reduce that load, creating a healthier environment around you.
So Sarah, can I just interrupt right there? When you're talking about contaminated water and mushrooms absorbing the toxins that are coming from the runoff, those mushrooms shouldn't be eaten, even if you're growing an edible mushroom. If they're drawing up the contaminated water, those mushrooms should just be used for cleaning your ground, not for eating, right?
There's the mycelium is actually what draws it and breaks it down. So maybe the first flush of mushrooms shouldn't be eaten, but usually by the time there's a second or third flush, they are no longer holding the contaminants in the mushroom itself. Oh, good. You're only going to want to avoid the mushrooms like the very first time, like very first spring flush, maybe, if you know for sure that area is heavily contaminated. If it's just light runoff contamination from what I was studying with the permaculture, it's not a big deal. Like if it's just the runoff from your shingled roof, it's the mycelium is going to break it down and it's not going to end up in the mushrooms themselves.
So if you were actually planting mushrooms, though, for remediating land that, say, had petroleum waste on it or something, then you would not want to eat those mushrooms. Is that correct?
Correct. If you're doing it specifically for soil remediation, you wouldn't want to eat it because the land is heavily contaminated. If it's just the light, for lack of a better way to phrase it, the standard contamination of living, it's not going to be harmful in the mushrooms because it's the same thing your plants are drawing up.
Okay, that's good to distinguish.
But if it's heavy for remediation, like it's remediating, say, an area that had a gas leak or something, then yeah, you would not want to consume it until you know the land is clean.
Okay.
And if you're remediating an area with a heavy gas leak, you're going to be testing the soil to find out when it's clean.
What kinds of mushrooms? You mentioned Garden Giant and you mentioned the grocery store mushrooms. How would people get started if they wanted to plant those?
Garden Giant, you're going to need to order a growing kit. And a growing kit is just basically sawdust and grain that's been spawned with the mushroom type that you want to grow. And then what you can do is when you start putting down your spring mulch to renew your mulch on your paths, or if you're creating like a leaf bed or something because you want to actually grow a bed of mushrooms, then you would just combine the mushroom spawn that you ordered in layers with your fresh leaf material, wood chips, etc., dampen it down, and then keep it damp.
Is there an explanation, like step-by-step in your book that would help people?
There's step-by-step for inoculating on smaller scales, for like straw, you can grow a Garden Giant just in straw in a large plant pot. You can do the same with the grocery store mushrooms. You can just use a plant pot, like one of those strawberry planter style pots, and you can actually grow mushrooms in those. But for the garden specific ones, it's just layers of, like I would start with a layer of cardboard, dampen it, put down some wood chips and leaves mixed together, dampen that, put the spawn on top, then add another layer and do probably 4 or 5 layers, alternating layers of food material with light layers of the spawn.
Fun. I'd like to try that this year.
With the grocery store mushrooms, you can actually choose really mature mushrooms from the grocery store, ones you normally wouldn't choose because they're slightly older, the gills are more open. So you know they have viable spore. And then you can just blend or chop those up with a little bit of soil and then layer that with some of your straw mulch, leaf mulch, wood chips, dirt, compost, green manure. For agaricus, you would want to add a couple layers of green manure in because they like manure and soil contact a little bit more so than the Garden Giant. Garden Giant likes its wood chips and straw more.
So what you're saying is we could actually be growing our own Portobello mushrooms.
Yep. The only difference between the Portobello and the porcini is actually the size they're permitted to get to before they're harvested. Because the porcini buttons are actually just Portobellos that haven't opened up yet.
Cool.
And that's the exciting. Button and the Portobellos are actually the same variety. They're both agaricus.
Okay, I think some questions have come in.
All right, just let me drop the...
So Susan is watching, Leslie's here. Hi, Alice, welcome. So this is pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to trying these mushrooms, and I have never grown Garden Giant before. We've done mushrooms on logs, we've done oyster mushrooms and shiitake, and I have to say, when we did log plugs on shiitake, and it took a long time before we got our first mushrooms. Probably, well, actually, the following fall, we got one mushroom from about 15 logs, but they didn't really start fruiting until last year, which was almost 4 years after we actually originally inoculated the logs. Now we're in zone 3 and we're quite cold, and I think that's one of the reasons they took so long. Our oyster mushrooms that we log inoculated, they produced the following fall and produced for 3 years, and now they're pretty much spent. I put the spent mushroom logs in the bottom of a hugelkultur bed, like you suggest, Sarah, so that hopefully they will flush through the soil and we'll have good mycelium in that bed. But I've never grown the Garden Giant, and I'm looking forward to trying that this year. So you're in a new garden, right, Sarah? And I think you told me that you're using Garden Giant specifically to take care of some jungling in your soil because you've got a walnut tree. Is that right?
Yeah, the richest part of my garden happens to be right under a walnut tree, and certain plants like peas just will not grow within the root zone of a walnut. So what I've done is actually created a couple little dividing paths in that garden zone, and I've put down newspaper leaves and the Garden Giant swan, so that hopefully in a year or two, I'll actually be able to grow peas in that area, which is actually my warmest area of the garden.
Oh, cool. Cool. So,
and then there's a couple other plants that don't grow near walnuts that I can't quite remember, but I have a couple of them in that area as well. And I'm hoping that adding the mushroom mycelium will actually help those plants start to grow because they're not thriving right now.
So there's actually other things people can do besides just move their plants away from a walnut.
Yep, you can add mushrooms to the soil to create that buffer zone. And of course, remove the fallen waste of the walnut, the hulls, the walnuts themselves, the leaves, so that they don't break down in the soil and add more while you're still trying to get rid of some of it.
So you're using Garden Giant. Do all mushrooms do that or just Garden Giant?
I believe both Garden Giant and the button mushrooms will, but it needs to be the soil-borne mushrooms. One mushroom that loves growing with walnut is actually lion's mane, but again, it grows on wood, not in soil.
So you need to use wood chips or something then if you wanted to put lion's mane in.
Yeah, and the lion's mane itself won't go into the soil to clean it because it's a wood-based mushroom.
Okay.
So for that one, well, I could grow it on like my walnut logs that we cut from the tree to trim it. It's not very helpful for the garden remediation with the walnut tree.
Okay. So could you just talk briefly about log culture, mushrooms, how you could use log culture in your garden?
So there's a couple different ways to culture mushrooms on logs specifically for being within the garden. For example, we've taken down a couple cottonwood trees close to our garden in a slightly shaded area. So I'm actually going to be inoculating those with oyster mushrooms to help break down the log over time and to hopefully get some harvest from the stumps.
Just one question. Are you going to inoculate the stump as it stands in the ground, or are you going to inoculate the logs that are separated?
I'm actually going to inoculate the stumps that are in the ground. Yeah. And I'm also going to use my lion's mane to inoculate some of the stump ends that are still attached to the walnut tree, to hopefully encourage at least some mushrooms to grow. And if they fruit, they fruit. If they don't, well, they don't.
So are mushrooms something like seed packages that you have to buy every year over and over again? Or are they perennial? How does that work?
Technically, they work as perennials because once the mycelium is established, you are not getting it out of your soil. It's not like a plant root that you grab the plant by one part, pull it out, and you've pulled out the entire plant. If you get a mushroom growing in your garden, it's probably growing off over 20 feet worth of mycelium.
Wow.
AKA square feet.
Wow. So if someone were to get Garden Giant and get it growing on their garden paths now in the spring, when would they expect their first mushrooms?
It can fruit as early as just a couple months. It depends on how fast the mycelium runs. Usually mushrooms fruit once they start running out of things to eat, or you get the right weather, the right dampness, the right rain amount to cause them to think, ooh, I can survive if I send out spore, and so they'll send up fruiting bodies. So earliest would probably be a couple of months. If you had some really heavy rain in, say, July, you could probably end up with mushrooms fruiting from it if you started it this spring, or probably guaranteed by August.
Depending on your zone.
If you were starting a dedicated mushroom bed, you would probably have it fruit in August. Absolute 100% guarantee next spring.
So what you're sharing with us today, does this apply to every garden zone, or are there differences in zone 8 compared to, say, my zone 3?
Well, you're going to have to water it a lot more if you're in zone 8.
So mushrooms are heavy water users.
Yeah. Well, they like it damp. They like it moist. And so you want to keep the area where they're trying to grow damp and moist. So it's best to use it like in your paths if you're doing overhead sprinkling. It'll help reduce your weeds because you're using the mulch, and then the mushrooms are growing throughout the mulch to turn it into compost, but they're also going to be out competing some of your weeds.
That sounds good. I like that. Less weeding.
In warmer zones, you may want to double check what temperatures the mushrooms like to fruit at. Most mushrooms like to fruit between 50 Fahrenheit and 70 Fahrenheit. So you're not going to get mushrooms fruiting in mid-July in Texas.
Okay. But they'll still fruit eventually.
But they'll probably fruit in the winter for Texas.
Okay. So there isn't really a difference in growing zone other than the amount of temperature and moisture. But someone in Texas could pretty much grow the same mushrooms I can grow here in zone 3. Is that correct?
Actually, they're going to have a couple of varieties that would be better for them to grow versus the ones that would be better for you to grow, particularly if we're talking log culture. Like if you're doing log culture for oyster mushrooms, there is actually a pink oyster mushroom that's native to Florida that would be very good for growing in Texas because it likes to fruit at 90 degrees.
Oh.
And that would not work very well in zone 3 because you would never get damp enough with a high enough temperature.
Right. So is that information in your book?
Yes, that information is in the book in the mushroom profiles.
Okay.
There are 9 different mushrooms talked about in the book, more than what we've actually talked about here. The profiles mention the temperature preference of the different mushrooms and as well as some of the different varieties. For the cooler zones, yellow and blue oyster mushrooms are usually better because they prefer a slightly cooler fruiting temperature.
Okay.
Whereas the pink oyster mushroom loves heat and is better for a warmer zone.
Good to know. So how can people connect with you?
They can connect with me on Ninja Gardening.
So that's your blog, ninjagardening.com?
Yep.
Where can people find your book? Is it available now or is it coming soon?
It is technically coming soon. Pre-orders are technically open on Amazon, but also I'm technically supposed to announce pre-orders around April 11th. So
we're a bit early, but I did check and the book is on Amazon right now for pre-order.
Yeah, they're still tweaking the page. So you can look at it on Amazon, and I can guarantee I'm the only author with my last name.
You have something to offer for people right now if they want to connect with you on your ninjagardening.com site, correct?
Yes, I have a short book about veggies to grow with kids, vegetables that are simple, bright colored, easy to grow, and that even picky eaters will most likely want to consume out of the garden rather than waiting for you to get them into the kitchen and wash them.
I remember when you were about 4 years old walking into the garden and you were picking all my sugar pod peas and eating them before they came into the house, and you were telling me they were chocolate peas. And I don't think that year we had any peas for dinner because you ate them all out of hand. Fun.
I was just reading someone's story about their 3-year-old going through their garden and biting off the main growing floor out of every single one out of 60 broccoli plants.
Oh my goodness. I'm glad you never did that. So there are good ways of gardening with children and not so productive ways of gardening with children, I take it. Maybe that'll be your next book. So thanks for
Well, one of the things
today.
I recommend in that little book is to set aside those plants in a kid-specified area where your kid knows they can go and graze.
Good idea.
And all the plants are suitable for containers, so you could even do it in just containers by your front door.
So I think the link is being shared to that resource if you want to download it. And also there's a link being shared to Sarah's book on Amazon if you want to check that out. Thanks for joining us today. We're coming to the end. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Sarah, before we say goodbye to everybody?
Not specifically, except mushrooms are a lot of fun.
Excellent. Excellent. They're fun guys, right?
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us today. Have a great week.